All right, we now turn the page to the second gospel according to Mark. And as we're going to see, Mark's a little bit shorter and has some very different, distinct aspects compared to Matthew that we just read and watched the video about, and even as we move forward with Luke and John. Now, as far as who wrote Matthew and some background on it, again, according to the second century church father, Papias, writing around 125 AD, the book of Mark, he claims, was written in the mid-60s. Now, if you remember what we talked about in our first video looking at Matthew, that there was a very immense, massive Jewish uprising at the end of the 60s, rebelling against the Roman Empire that would lead to their utter defeat and destruction from 67 to 70. And it appears that when you read the book of Mark, it doesn't appear that that has happened yet. So it actually makes sense that this was written probably before 67, so the early 60s. This also means, from as best we can tell, it most likely was the first gospel written. It appears that way, and we'll give some reasons for it as we move forward. So it's probably the first gospel, not necessarily the oldest book, but probably the first gospel. And it fits well in that idea. So the author, according to Papias, was a man named John Mark, who's referenced in the Bible. He was both a companion of Paul, so he traveled with Paul, but he was also later an interpreter of Peter. So we have known him both, and you've got a lot of background information that way. And Papias said that Mark would actually write things down as Peter remembered them. This may or not be accurate. One of the problems, I guess you could say, is it has a very negative portrayal of the disciples. But I've heard a really reasonable and rational pushback on that, which is, well, if you're Peter and you're telling John Mark about who you were before Jesus, you're probably going to point out all your shortcomings. And maybe that's the way that Peter wanted John Mark to hear the story. So either way, it's fairly it's generally accepted that John Mark probably wrote the letter. Not a ton of reason to question or think otherwise. But more than who Mark actually was as a person or the author, the biggest area of importance, I think, for you and I to understand his message is actually to understand who he was writing to. A great deal of nuance and detail will come out when we grasp his particular audience. Because remember when we saw in Matthew, he was writing to probably Jewish Christians to convince them, yes, he is the fulfillment. Who was Mark writing to? Because we'll actually find that can change the way he told his story. So rather than just tell you, I actually want to start by pointing out a few things to you and letting you kind of draw some conclusions. First, just compare Mark to Matthew. So you've already read Matthew, you've watched the video. Now look at it and compare, look at Mark next to it. And even if you want to include Luke, you'll notice right off the bat, it's considerably shorter. It's very concise, way more to the point. But what are the things that are not included? Well, notice there's no genealogy or birth story. There's no things were done in order to fulfill kind of statements that we saw again and again in Matthew. Those were a huge part of Matthew that wanted to tie Jesus to the Old Testament. Who is Matthew writing to? Jewish people. There's no Sermon on the Mount, there's really not that much extended teaching at all. There isn't a lot of that interaction with the law. Where Matthew finds the teachings of Jesus central, giving of a new law, replacing Moses, Mark focuses way more on the actions of Jesus. Mark is a very boom, 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 a lot of stuff happening, power, miracles, stories of Jesus doing things with a little teaching mixed in here and there. So already you're different. You also don't have many of the very familiar, famous parables. They're very absent. The Good Samaritan, Prodigal Son, those kind of stories. The stories that would resonate with Jewish people are actually absent. So what does that tell you? It appears Mark was most likely writing to an audience that wouldn't have been that familiar or even cared that much about prophecy, tying the Old Testament, or the ins and outs and the reworkings of the Torah. He was most likely writing to Gentiles, people that had no background or history in Judaism. Along with not including as much Jewish cultural items, Mark's very different in how he portrays the disciples. If Mark were the only gospel, you'd probably come away thinking that these guys were just a bunch of idiots. Right? Mark tends to highlight their failures, their mistakes, their letdowns. Honestly, they just look a bit silly at times. Let me give you a quick example. In both Mark and Matthew, there's a story of Jesus walking on the water. In Mark, it ends with them getting in the boat and they're terrified, they're scared. How does Matthew end his story? Peter walks out onto the water and then they get in the boat and they worship Jesus. What a completely different angle to take on that story. I'm not saying they're both true, but Mark doesn't include that one of the disciples walked on water. It's almost like, I'm not saying anything that make these guys look good. That's not the point of the story. They were just dumb oafs that really made a lot of mistakes, but there's a reason for it. And we're going to see it. It's intentional. I think Mark is being intentional here, and we'll see why in a bit. Finally, Mark places a ton of focus on a prophecy from the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament that prophesied about the one who would come, the Messiah. But Isaiah didn't use the word Messiah. Isaiah used the phrase suffering servant, one who would serve us through suffering. The one who's going to come and lead us would actually serve through suffering. It wasn't a hugely popular prophecy in Isaiah, and it wasn't a lot focused on, but it's all over in the book of Mark, whereby the Messiah suffers and calls those who follow him to face difficulty as well. There's a great deal that points to Jesus' pain, the cross, the cost of following him. Mark is the gospel that paints Jesus in the most human terms, the most like, this is hard, this is suffering, this is painful. A great deal of human qualities, especially dealing with pain and rejection. So who is Mark writing to? Well, we could expect they were probably Gentiles dealing with some hardship, struggling to stay faithful, right? Wrestling with what it means to follow Jesus. Well, according to Papias, that was exactly Mark's audience. Papias tells us that he was writing to a Gentile church in the city of Rome in the early 60s. Why does that matter? We know from history that this was one of the worst times to be a Christian in the Roman Empire, especially in the capital. In 64 AD, there was a terrible fire in Rome. You might have heard of this. A terrible fire, massive amounts of destruction. And in an effort to sort of cover it up or shift direction, the Emperor Nero, who some people think was a little off his rocker, needed someone to blame historically. So we believe that he used Christians as a scapegoat because they were already kind of weird. They talked about drinking blood and I don't know, they were just whatever. Those Christians, they're the ones that did it. And this led to one of the worst seasons of persecution and suffering in the history of the church. It was very early on there in the early 60s. They were thrown to lions. They were killed by gladiators. There's stories of them actually being put on posts and lit on fire to be human torches at tea parties. I mean, just really rough stuff. It was a terrible time for someone to be a confessing Christian. It probably made a lot of them want to give up, to denounce their faith and be like, we don't want to do this anymore. This is too hard. It's not worth it. And so here Mark retells the story of the king who wasn't just a powerful king who came and made everyone bow and scrape. He was a king who actually suffered and died and called his followers to do the same. So we can see why understanding the audience, who he's writing to, gives us a key to understanding what the book is actually getting at. Yes, it's telling the story of Jesus, but it's got an agenda, and the agenda is the suffering side of Jesus that he calls us to. So let's look at some of the distinct elements, and you're actually going to see the way this kind of plays out. Some of the things that make Mark very different. We already talked about he's shorter. One of the things is there's a sense of urgency in Mark. The book doesn't waste time. It's just boom, boom, boom. There's a message, and you need to respond to the message. Mark uses the word immediately 42 times. 42 times Mark says immediately, immediately. Well, I suppose if you are living a life that literally, I could die at any minute, all around me is suffering persecution, you might feel some urgency too, maybe. But it makes Mark feel like a fast-paced action novel. Go, 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 quick movement, rapid fire activity, urgency. There's also this sense of secrecy, which trips people up a lot, secrecy. This is another often repeated idea. Again and again, Jesus commands others in Mark, even demons, to keep quiet and not tell people. Don't say anything. Be quiet. He heals people and says, don't tell anyone. Peter confesses he's the Christ, and he's all, keep that to yourself. What's the deal with all the mystery and secrecy? We'll come back to that. Here's another one, all over the book of Mark, blindness. There's this recurring theme of blindness or lack of seeing, lack of understanding. The disciples and the crowds are constantly described, especially at the beginning, by their lack of understanding of what Jesus is doing. They don't see it. And again, Jesus speaks to people having eyes but not being able to see. There are numerous occasions of Jesus healing blind people, and we'll actually see that they don't appear random. Mark seems to put those stories in very specific places. What's this about? Let me give you one more. And this is my favorite thing about Mark. Mark loves this. Theologians, Bible scholars use this word inclusio, which sounds like inclusion. It means story within a story. When reading Mark, you want to pay special attention to the way that he arranges certain stories. They're almost never random. He always likes to weave together what almost seem like unrelated stories. Almost like, is this guy got ADHD? Well, like, why? Where's he going? Why is he talking about this? But then you look closer and you realize there's actually something behind the story here that connects to what just happened before or after it. And it really is pretty brilliant. Amidst sending out the disciples, he then just shifts and tells a story about John being beheaded. You're like, what? Why'd you just do that? It seems unrelated, but then you think about what just happened. He's just sent his disciples out into a very difficult world that even killed John the Baptist. What should they expect? They should expect persecution, possibly even death. Look, see what Mark is doing there? We'll get into a few more as we continue on. So we have a sense of urgency. Boom, urgency, go. A sense of secrecy, mystery, not getting it. I don't understand. Blindness. A style of writing that seems to want to hide the main point, hiding stories inside of other stories, healing blind people, talking about people not getting it. You got to search for something here. You see the thread? There's something you're not getting. There's something mysterious. There's something hidden here that you got to look deeper at. And we'll come back to that when we hit the main theme. There's something under the surface. So let me start here. Let me do a quick walkthrough. And as we do a walkthrough, keep those things in mind. Urgency, secrecy, mystery, blindness, stories within stories, something behind the scenes we don't get. So Mark opens with the introduction that Jesus is the good news of the Messiah, but much quicker, more concise than Matthew. Again, likely due to who he was writing, the birth stories. He's not trying to talk about how Jesus fulfilled prophecy. Not that Mark didn't believe that, but that Mark has an agenda for writing. He's writing to some specific people, and he's using the story of Jesus to communicate something about Jesus to them. So his introduction is quick, it's concise, not a lot of background. He just wants to get straight to the action. He doesn't need to convince people of prophecy. He wants to convince them of something else. Matthew and Luke probably read Mark. They probably both had Mark and thought, oh man, there's so much more you missed out here, Mark. My Jewish friends need more detail than this. And they add to Mark a lot, but Mark is just right to the point. So right at the beginning, in the middle of chapter 1, all the way through chapter 3, is the proclamation of the kingdom. God's king has arrived. God's rule and reign is here. And Jesus demonstrates it through mighty deeds. So, like Matthew, which the people have been waiting. The thing they've been waiting for is here. They can see it. And Jesus has power. He has authority. He calls the disciples. He amazes the crowds. And as word of him begins to spread, quickly, so does the opposition. Rising up begins questioning him. And you have 5 stories that demonstrate the Pharisees doubting him and questioning him. So now you have Jesus coming up, showing in power, and then all of a sudden, immediately there's pushback. In chapter 3, verses 8, he now talks about the mystery of the kingdom. Mark breaks down Jesus' audience into 3 different groups. You have the crowds that are just amazed. Oh, wow, You have the disciples who are called, but don't quite know what they're called to. And then you have the rest of the people who are just opposed. We don't like this, we don't get it, and we're going to fight it. But it's here that this idea of mystery and secrecy really takes shape, as Jesus begins to teach in parables, which are like, what are you talking about? And through it all, faith is highlighted as people who believe or commit to Jesus without all the information. They're the ones that get it. Well, get what? What's happening here? Jesus talks about the kingdom being something people don't quite understand, and how those around him, including his own disciples, have eyes but fail to see. They hear, but they don't actually get it, the mystery of what Jesus is doing. They see the miracles and the power, but they don't quite know what's happening. So what is this urgent mystery? What's this thing that's hidden behind the scenes that people are so blind to? Well, you get to the middle of chapter 8, and you see it up through 10. Up to chapter 8, Jesus has been trying to teach people and explain who he is and what he's doing, but they don't get it. Here, this section begins, and watch what he does here. This section begins with a blind man who can't see. Jesus has just fed the 4,000, and the disciples are like, what's up? He's like, you guys don't get it. All of a sudden, Mark tells you a story of a blind man. Jesus comes to him to heal him and touches him, and it says that he's not fully healed. He's like, I can kind of see, but it looks like I see like people that look like trees, but I can't quite see. And then Jesus touches him again, and this time he sees clearly. Well, guess what? Immediately after that story, Jesus says, who do people say that I am? And the disciples say, well, some say Elijah or John the Baptist. And Peter says, you're the Christ. Ah, you finally get it. Just like the blind man who needed he didn't quite see, but now he fully sees. Now you guys fully see who I am. But, here's the key to Mark. It's not just that you're the Christ. Matthew is all about he's the Christ. And we'll see so is Luke. They're all about being the Christ. There's more than just being the Christ, okay? The real mystery here, they were expecting a Christ. They were expecting a king to come and lead them. That wasn't the mystery. The mystery, the confusing thing that they don't quite get, that they're blind to, is that he wasn't going to come as a conquering hero and slay their enemies. Rather, that he would suffer and die. The mystery of Jesus' kingdom is the humility and self-sacrificial love that is required to follow this Messiah and carry your cross. 3 times now he predicts his death and speaks of loving and laying your life down and surrendering, and greatness is found by not trying to be first but being last and being a servant and all these things. Stop fighting on who the grace is. Let me show you the truth of the kingdom of God, which is it's not what you're expecting. And even then they still don't quite get it. They still don't quite grasp that God's kingdom coming is not about power and violence and dominance. And even here, those who have eyes just still can't quite see it. And then you get to the middle of 10, and you now see the suffering servant on display. Like it's clear now. In this final section, you see it turn for Matthew. It was this repeated phrase after Jesus had said it. But for Mark, it's the clever use of these sort of odd, seemingly random stories, often healing stories. So right after a section of Jesus trying to explain this like vital, important mystery of the kingdom, that if you want to be great, you must become last, his disciples just aren't getting it. Jesus tells another story. Mark tells another story of Jesus healing a blind man and being given his sight. He sees Jesus as the Son of David. Son of David, have mercy on me. Christ, Messiah, have mercy on me. He's a blind man who can see that he's the Messiah, who's come to help the low and the weak, even though the people with sight can't see he's the Messiah. You see what happens? And this marks the end of Jesus trying to explain. That story is the last time in Mark that Jesus will try to explain who he is. A blind man saw it. It's time that you guys see it too. And so from here on out, he begins to actually be the suffering servant. We see him curse a fig tree for not producing fruit. Like, that's random. Why would you do that? Kind of odd for Mark to throw that in there. But then he goes in Jerusalem and pronounces judgment on all of them. You've all been blind. You've all missed it. You failed at God, being God's servant to the world. He speaks some parables about them being bad tenants and wicked servants who weren't faithful to the master. None of this is random. It's all been building up to what he's talking about. That the kingdom was always about serving and laying down your life, not fighting for your own rights. That Israel was always supposed to be a light to the world by loving the world and giving to the world, but they failed. So now their king has come to do it for them, to demonstrate once and for all what God's kingdom is actually about. It's a different kind of power. It's a different kind of greatness. And this is what no one up to this point had been able to see. They were blind to it. They thought it was all about them and their kingdom and their greatness. And Jesus came to open their eyes to this mystery and tell Israel, like, you missed the point here. And so the suffering servant representing the people would lay down his life. And then what happens? You see the fig tree and it's withered and dead. And it's almost like Mark saying, Israel's the withered fig tree. Now the new kingdom of God is something different. And then you have a relatively long passion narrative. Given the overall length of the book of Mark, a lot of it is dedicated to Jesus' crucifixion, which again, it makes sense because the whole point Mark is trying to say is the mystery is that the king that we were waiting for was a suffering king. What we've all been blind to is that was who God always was. As we were fighting and warring for our land, possessions and authority and all this kind of stuff, Jesus came and showed us that we were blind. And our true calling was to love and lay our lives down like he did. Now, the end of Mark is confusing. You have an epilogue where Jesus is risen, but that's it. There's no Easter stories. There's no proof. What happened, right? What happened after that? Mark seems to sort of just leave it at this cliffhanger. Why? This actually led people to later add an ending to Mark. So most of your Bibles that include more stuff at the end will put a little note saying, we actually think this was a later addition. Instead, the reader is just sort of left to ask questions, wanting to know more. It's as if Mark wants his readers to be upset with the ending and seek out more information. I have been blind. I want to give me the truth now. Mark wants to leave you with this sense of, oh, I need to know the truth now. Calling you to ask questions. There's an urgency through this book that you need to respond to it. You've been blind. You've been wrong. You haven't understood who God is and who the Messiah is. Now you see it. How will you respond? And in many ways, I would even argue, and this is more my opinion, because Mark's whole point is in showing the suffering of Jesus, he doesn't even maybe want to spend as much time talking about the resurrection. He believes it. Absolutely, he believes it. And he wants you to believe it. But he's really focusing. Again, he's choosing what he's wanting to talk about because he's talking about those who are suffering, those who are going through what Jesus went through. And that really then becomes, I think, the main theme of the book of Mark. All the secrecy, blindness, misunderstanding, it points to this big idea that Jesus was not the kind of Messiah that one was expecting. He wasn't the kind of king they were looking for. Yes, he could perform mighty miracles, but his true heart was as the suffering servant who laid his life down and called you and I to do the same with him. And this would be foolishness to the Greeks. What kind of God would do that? What kind of, right? And it would be a stumbling block to the Jews. No, our Messiah is coming to kill Romans, right? All of them struggled with this. But this is the kingdom. Any other perception is blindness. You don't understand the mystery. This is what we were always called to, and this is where we will find true hope and healing and greatness in God's kingdom, by laying our lives down the way that he did. And if it means dying at the hands of Nero and his empire, so be it. If it means suffering, so be it, because he suffered. And that's the other main theme, which I would say is just the cost of discipleship. Again and again, Jesus predicts his own suffering and says, if I did it, you're not greater than me, right? Following him would not be easy. It would not bring about political greatness. It's not going to make you guys rich. It's not going to, do all some of the things you wish it did. But God's kingdom is going to invade, and it's going to break down our selfish pride and our arrogance and teach us to live sacrificially and to love each other. This is the mystery that we're called to respond to, because it's the mystery of who God is revealed in Jesus as the suffering servant. So, for a group of suffering Christians in Rome, asking themselves, is this all worth it? Reading Mark's story of Jesus revealing what it's all about, and Jesus suffering, Jesus going through it, and everyone seeing his suffering and saying, that's not supposed to be it. Saying, no, that is what it's supposed to be. So if you're suffering, you're on the right path. You're following Jesus. You're carrying your cross just like he did. So keep following his example. This is the mystery, that greatness in God's kingdom is found in weakness, service, and laying down your life for others. Anything else is blindness. It's a wisdom of the world, not wisdom of the cross. Which makes Mark just an incredible book, doesn't it? Such an awesome thing. So I encourage you, as you finish this video, start in chapter 1 and read through the whole thing. It's a shorter book. Read the thing through. Pay attention to these themes of suffering, cost of discipleship, blindness, urgency. You'll see them really pop out. Look for the ways in which a suffering Christian would hear the story of Mark and be so encouraged and inspired by it. And hopefully you're encouraged and inspired by it as well. Okay? All right, that's the book of Mark. In our next video, we'll keep moving forward with another story of Jesus as told according to the author Luke. Thanks, guys.